Elijah Brooks had lost his voice and the use of his legs, but not his dignity. Sitting quietly in his wheelchair beside his devoted wife, Evelyn, he arrived at a luxury island resort, a dream trip gifted by their billionaire son. Dressed simply, the elderly black couple were judged by two white staff members who decided they did not belong. Their finest services were given to wealthy white guests instead, and the humiliation soon turned cruel. By the time Evelyn was shoved and Elijah was thrown from his wheelchair, no one expected the truth to explode in the buffet hall that night, when their son arrived and the silent father finally spoke. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Morning sunlight spilled across the private marina in Miami, Florida, turning the water into trembling gold. A warm breeze moved in from the bay, soft and salty, while gulls circled above the polished white decks of a luxury yacht preparing to depart for Azure Palm Island Resort, a private paradise off the coast near St. Augustine. For most of the passengers, it was the beginning of a glamorous escape. For Elijah and Evelyn Brooks, it was something even rarer, a gift they had never imagined they would live to receive. Elijah Brooks sat quietly in his wheelchair at the edge of the boarding platform, his hands folded on a thin blanket across his lap. At 78, he had the kind of face that seemed carved by years of heat, labor, and silence. His dark brown skin was lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, and his jaw still held the old firmness of a man who had spent most of his life fixing engines with his bare hands. Before illness took his speech and the strength in his legs, Elijah had been a mechanic in Jacksonville, the kind of man neighbors trusted with broken cars, broken fences, and sometimes broken pride. He had never been wealthy, but he had always been useful, and usefulness had once been the language through which he expressed love. The stroke had changed all of that. Now words lived somewhere inside him, trapped behind a body that no longer obeyed. He could still feel anger, gratitude, shame, and joy with all the force of the man he had once been. But he could no longer release those feelings into the world. That helplessness had made him quieter over the years, but not weaker. The dignity in his posture remained. So did the fierce intelligence in his eyes. Behind him stood Evelyn Brooks, his wife of 52 years, her hands resting gently on the wheelchair handles as though they had belonged there forever. At 74, Evelyn was small and slender, with soft brown skin, silver-gray curls tucked beneath a cream headscarf, and a face worn by worry but lit by patience. She dressed simply in a blue cardigan, a long floral dress, and comfortable shoes polished until they looked newer than they were. There was nothing flashy about her, yet there was something deeply graceful in the way she moved, careful, steady, and always attentive to Elijah before herself. Evelyn had once worked nights as a nursing assistant while raising their son and helping Elijah keep food on the table. Years of tending to sick bodies had taught her how fragile life could be, but caring for her husband after the stroke had taught her something harder, how to remain gentle without surrendering to grief. She had learned how to read Elijah's silence better than most people understood speech. A twitch in his fingers, a shift in his gaze, the tightening of his jaw. These were sentences to her. She leaned down and adjusted the collar of his light brown jacket. "You look handsome," she whispered with a smile meant to steady him. "Don't let all this luxury scare you." Elijah looked up at her and blinked slowly, the closest he could come to laughter. The trip had been arranged by their son, Daniel Brooks, who now lived a life so different from theirs that the strangers often struggled to believe they belonged to one family. Daniel, 46, was a black American tech billionaire based in New York, known in business magazines for his sharp mind, controlled charisma, and astonishing rise from a working-class childhood. Tall and lean, with warm brown skin, a disciplined posture, and eyes that missed very little, Daniel had built a travel technology empire that later expanded into luxury investments, hospitality, and private philanthropy. Yet the people who knew him best said his defining trait was not ambition. It was loyalty. As a boy, Daniel had watched his father work double shifts and his mother skip meals so he could stay in school. He never forgot the years when their home had needed repairs they could not afford, when his mother hid overdue bills in kitchen drawers, when his father came home with oil on his hands and still smiled at him like hope was something a man could build. Success had made Daniel powerful, but those early hardships had made him deliberate. He spent money boldly in business and quietly in love. This journey was one of those quiet acts of love. Neither Elijah nor Evelyn knew the full extent of what Daniel had arranged. He had told them only that they deserved rest, sea air, and a place beautiful enough to make them forget hospitals, medicines, and long nights. What he had not told them was that he had booked them into the Presidential Diamond Package, the highest level of service at Azure Palm Island Resort. Private transport, premium dining, oceanfront suite, spa access adapted for mobility care, and a personal concierge team instructed to treat them like royalty. But when royalty arrived dressed like ordinary people, the world did not always recognize it. A few feet away stood 2 resort employees assigned to the yacht's welcome team. The first was Chloe Whitman, a white woman in her late 20s with sleek blonde hair pinned into a neat twist, a narrow face, and blue eyes sharpened by habit into permanent judgment. She was tall, slim, and impeccably groomed, the sort of woman who wore her uniform as if it were a badge of superiority rather than service. Chloe had grown up craving a life that looked expensive from the outside, and somewhere along the way she had mistaken elegance for worth. She spoke politely when needed, but her politeness often felt like glass, clear, cold, and ready to cut. Beside her stood Vanessa Hale, also white, around 30, shorter and curvier, with auburn hair tucked beneath a crisp scarf, and a pleasant smile that disappeared the moment she thought no guest important enough was watching. Vanessa was less openly sharp than Chloe, but far more eager to follow her lead. If Chloe supplied the cruelty, Vanessa supplied the agreement. Chloe looked at Elijah's wheelchair, then at Evelyn's modest dress, and her expression shifted by a fraction. Small enough that most people would miss it, but not Evelyn. "That can't be them," Chloe murmured under her breath. Vanessa glanced at the manifest in her hand. "The Brooks family booking is the Presidential Diamond arrival." Chloe gave a faint, disbelieving smile. "Exactly." Evelyn heard the tone even if she could not hear every word. Her hand tightened slightly on Elijah's chair. Elijah sensed it at once and turned his eyes toward her. She offered him a reassuring nod, but a familiar ache had already stirred in her chest. She knew that look. She had seen it in department stores, at reception desks, in restaurants where people assumed she was in the wrong place before she had said a single word. Just then, another couple approached the boarding area from behind them, and Chloe's entire face changed. The man was Richard Sterling, a white guest in his early 60s, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, wearing a tailored linen suit, expensive loafers, and the satisfied expression of someone long accustomed to being welcomed first. His wife, Margaret Sterling, elegant and composed, moved beside him in a cream designer dress, pearl earrings, and a wide-brimmed hat that turned heads before she ever spoke. Margaret, around 58, had the poised beauty of old-money refinement, but unlike her husband, her eyes were observant rather than entitled. She noticed things. Sometimes too late, but she noticed them. Chloe stepped forward immediately, smiling so brightly it bordered on performance. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," she said warmly, "welcome. We've been expecting you." Richard paused, pleasantly surprised. "Well," he said, glancing at Margaret, "that's excellent service." Margaret frowned. "Richard, I don't think—" But Chloe was already signaling staff. At once, a porter rushed to take the Sterling's luggage. Another appeared with chilled towels. A third offered crystal flutes of sparkling wine. Vanessa began describing suite privileges, spa bookings, premium dining, and a sunset tasting menu prepared specially for their arrival. Evelyn stood frozen. For one long second, she thought surely someone would realize the mistake, surely the names would be checked. Surely the staff would look again at the booking notes. Daniel was meticulous. He would have prepared everything clearly, but Chloe did not want clarity. She wanted confirmation of what she had already decided. Elijah's fingers curled slowly over the blanket in his lap. His jaw tightened. Evelyn saw it and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," she said softly, though it clearly was not. "Please, not today." The Sterlings exchanged a glance. Margaret looked back toward Evelyn and Elijah, uncertainty flickering across her face. But Richard had already surrendered to the seduction of being treated as important. Meanwhile, Chloe finally turned back to the Brookses with the kind of smile reserved for inconvenience. "Standard boarding is to the left," she said. "Someone will assist you when available." Evelyn blinked. "Excuse me, ma'am, I think there may be some confusion. My son arranged this trip for us. The name is Brooks. Elijah and Evelyn Brooks." Chloe's eyes dropped briefly to Evelyn's handbag, her worn cardigan, then rose again. "Yes," she said almost lazily, "and as I said, someone will assist you when available." The humiliation was subtle enough to remain deniable, which made it worse. Before Evelyn could answer, her phone began to ring. She quickly pulled it from her purse. On the screen was Daniel. Far above Florida, on a private flight heading south from New York, Daniel Brooks sat by the window in a charcoal suit with his tie loosened and his expression sharpened by concern. Even in motion, he carried the contained energy of a man used to solving problems before they became visible. He had already called the resort twice that morning. Now, he was calling again. When Evelyn answered, his voice came warm and steady. "Mama, have you boarded yet?" "We're about to," Evelyn said, forcing brightness into her tone. "Everything's fine." Daniel knew his mother well enough to hear the thin place in her voice. "You sure?" She looked at Elijah, at the staff swarming around the wrong couple, at Chloe pretending not to hear her, and chose peace for the moment. "We're all right, baby," she said. "Your father's just tired." Daniel hesitated. "I've spoken with the general manager personally. His name is Michael Carter. He knows exactly who you are. He's supposed to make sure everything is perfect." At the mention of Michael Carter, Chloe's eyes flicked briefly toward Vanessa. Because miles away, though Daniel did not know it, Michael Carter was not a neutral guardian of guest experience. Michael, the resort's general manager, was a handsome white man in his early 40s with polished manners, a confident baritone, and the practiced authority of someone who had spent years mastering luxury hospitality. But beneath a tailored professionalism lived something weaker than cruelty and often more dangerous: vanity. He liked to be admired. He liked loyalty that did not question him, and lately he had grown far too close to Chloe Whitman, whose admiration came wrapped in flirtation and shared secrets. That closeness had quietly turned into favoritism, and favoritism, once mixed with prejudice, could become disaster. Back at the marina, Evelyn ended the call and slipped the phone away. Chloe gestured impatiently toward a side ramp. A junior porter, young, nervous, and clearly not empowered to object, finally came to take Elijah's wheelchair. Evelyn thanked him with more kindness than he had earned from anyone else that morning. As the Brookses were guided toward ordinary boarding, the Sterlings were escorted onto the yacht like honored dignitaries. Premium luggage tags were attached to the wrong bags. The wrong welcome package was handed over. Somewhere below deck, the finest suite on the ship was being prepared for the wrong guests. Elijah turned his head once more toward the shining staircase where the Sterlings disappeared under smiling attention. Then he looked ahead, into the narrow side entrance where no one was smiling at all. His hand closed into a fist. Evelyn saw it, covered it gently with her own, and began to push him forward. Behind them, the yacht horn sounded over the glittering water. The dream voyage had begun, and already it was heading in the wrong direction. The yacht had left the Miami marina behind, and now the Atlantic stretched around it in endless bands of blue and silver. Sunlight danced across the water, bright enough to make the polished rails gleam like mirrors, while the upper decks filled with the low hum of wealthy passengers settling into luxury. For most guests, the voyage to Azure Palm Island Resort was already becoming a memory worth photographing. For Elijah and Evelyn Brooks, however, the beauty of the sea was being slowly overshadowed by the quiet cruelty of being made invisible. Elijah sat in his wheelchair near the side corridor where the junior porter had left them, his body angled away from the main observation deck. The chair itself was comfortable enough, but the space was not what Daniel had intended. Ahead, through a set of glass doors, Elijah could see the private Ocean View lounge area that had clearly been reserved for elite guests. Plush cream chairs faced the horizon, each paired with small marble tables holding folded towels, chilled drinks, and silver trays of fruit. At the very center of the deck, positioned perfectly to catch the sea breeze and sunset later that evening, stood a specially adapted reclining chair with additional back support and a leg extension. Exactly the kind of thoughtful accommodation Daniel would have ordered for his father, and exactly the kind of accommodation now occupied by Richard Sterling. Richard lounged in the chair as though he had been born into it, one arm draped lazily over the side, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in hand. The white linen suit he had changed into made him look even more like a man designed for luxury travel brochures. His weathered but still handsome face carried the relaxed confidence of privilege, and every time a passing steward addressed him with exaggerated respect, the confidence deepened into satisfaction. Beside him sat Margaret Sterling, elegant as ever in a pale silk shawl over her cream dress, though the enjoyment on her face was far less complete. Margaret was the sort of woman whose refinement came not only from wealth, but from years of observation. She noticed the stitching on uniforms, the tone of voices, the difference between genuine hospitality and rehearsed deference. Earlier, she had dismissed her unease as a misunderstanding. But now, as another steward arrived carrying a silver tray with imported cheeses, fruit preserves, and a bottle of champagne old enough to deserve reverence, her discomfort sharpened. She leaned slightly toward Richard. "Don't you think this is a bit much?" Richard glanced at the tray, amused. "My dear, it's called excellent service." "No," Margaret said softly, her blue-gray eyes drifting toward the side corridor where she had earlier glimpsed Evelyn and Elijah. "It feels more like someone is trying very hard to impress the wrong people." Richard let out a low chuckle. "Then I suppose we should be gracious enough to let them." He lifted his glass again, and Margaret's concern went unanswered. On the lower side deck, Evelyn gently pushed Elijah's wheelchair forward, searching for somewhere quieter. The route Chloe had directed them through had left them far from the panoramic lounge, in a narrow shaded section near the service doors where crew members passed with trays and luggage carts. It was not loud, but it was isolated, as if the most important thing was to keep them out of sight. A younger steward, a Latino man in his mid-20s named Luis Moreno, nearly collided with them as he hurried past carrying folded blankets. He was lean, dark-haired, and moved with the nervous speed of someone still new enough to fear every mistake. His face had an openness that made him seem younger than he was, and unlike Chloe or Vanessa, his first instinct was to see the people in front of him rather than their clothes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly, stepping back. "Are you all right?" Evelyn offered him a kind smile. "We're fine, sweetheart. I was just hoping to find a quieter place for my husband to enjoy the view." Luis hesitated, glancing toward the private observation deck and then back at Evelyn. He clearly understood the implication. He had seen the premium service team lavish attention on the Sterlings. He had also seen the manifest earlier that morning, where the name Brooks had been highlighted in gold for the presidential diamond package. His brow tightened. "I thought," he began, then stopped himself. Crew hierarchy on luxury vessels was not kind to uncertainty. "Let me see if there's somewhere more comfortable." Before he could help, Vanessa Hale appeared from the corridor with the clipped authority of someone who enjoyed enforcing invisible boundaries. Vanessa's auburn hair was perfectly pinned, her lipstick flawless, and her smile held the same polished emptiness as before. If Chloe was the architect of judgment, Vanessa was its willing gatekeeper. "That section is reserved," Vanessa said coolly, cutting Luis off before he could continue. Her eyes flicked toward Evelyn's cardigan and Elijah's blanket-covered lap. "General guests should remain in the standard seating areas." Evelyn kept her tone calm. "My husband is sensitive to crowds. I'm only asking for a quiet place where he can breathe and look at the ocean." Vanessa's expression did not soften. "The standard seating is more than sufficient." Elijah's fingers curled around the armrests of his wheelchair. The veins in his hands stood out sharply as his grip tightened. His shoulders trembled, not from weakness, but from the force of anger locked inside a body that could no longer release it. Through the glass doors ahead, he could see Richard Sterling being served another course, a perfectly plated steak lunch, medium rare, steam rising from roasted vegetables and garlic butter potatoes. That had to be Daniel's doing. His son knew exactly what foods he still enjoyed despite the years of physical decline. Steak had always been Elijah's favorite, something he associated with rare celebrations, birthdays, and the nights when Daniel came home from college with stories bigger than their kitchen table. Now that carefully chosen gift was in another man's hands. Evelyn saw Elijah's trembling and immediately placed one hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light, but steady enough to ground him. "It's all right," she whispered, leaning close so only he could hear. "Don't let this steal the peace your son wanted for us." Elijah's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the deck beyond the glass. For a moment, Evelyn feared he might try to force himself to stand in anger, something his body was no longer capable of doing safely. But after several long seconds, the tension in his shoulders eased just enough for her to know he had heard her. She turned back to Vanessa. "Then, could someone at least help us find a seat away from the foot traffic?" Vanessa's smile returned, colder now because it was performative. "If something opens up later, we'll let you know." She did not wait for a reply. Luis lingered for half a second after Vanessa walked away, his face shadowed by quiet discomfort. "I'm sorry," he said under his breath. Evelyn gave him the kind of grace that people like Chloe and Vanessa never expected from those they humiliated. "It's not your fault." Luis nodded and moved on, but the doubt had already taken root in him. As afternoon drifted toward evening, the misdirected privileges only multiplied. Richard and Margaret were escorted to a private dining alcove for sunset cocktails. A server presented them with a handwritten menu embossed in gold leaf, featuring a premium steak dinner paired with a rare vintage champagne from Daniel's personal cellar collection. Richard, delighted by the absurd generosity, accepted every course with the complacent pleasure of a man who had stopped questioning why the world kept handing him comfort. Margaret, however, could no longer ignore the unease. "This package doesn't match our reservation," she said quietly when the server stepped away. Richard sliced into the steak, rich juices pooling onto the porcelain plate. "Then someone upgraded us." Without explanation, with a handwritten note welcoming the Brooks family? Richard paused. Margaret's gaze moved toward the far end of the deck where she could just make out Evelyn seated beside Elijah in an ordinary lounge chair near the service hall, feeding him small pieces of bread from a simple plate she had assembled herself from the public buffet. "That woman," Margaret said softly. "The older black woman. She said their name was Brooks." Richard's fork hovered midair. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But the scent of butter and grilled steak, the sparkle of the champagne, and the seductive ease of privilege were easier to accept than moral inconvenience. "You're imagining things," he said at last, and resumed eating. Margaret said nothing more, but she no longer touched her meal. Later, as twilight painted the ocean in streaks of orange and violet, Evelyn finally guided Elijah toward their assigned suite. She had hoped the room might at least restore some sense of dignity to the trip, but when the attendant opened the door, what awaited them was not the sweeping sunset suite Daniel had described. Instead, it was a modest interior cabin tucked near the middle deck, with no balcony, no sea-facing windows, and barely enough space to maneuver Elijah's wheelchair comfortably. Functional? Yes. Luxurious? No. Elijah stared at the narrow room, then slowly turned his gaze toward Evelyn. His hand tightened around the wheelchair rail once more, trembling harder this time. Evelyn knelt beside him, her voice barely above the hum of the engine beneath the floor. "I know," she said gently, "but we are still together. That's what matters." The words were meant for him, but she needed them too. Outside, the sun sank lower, and on the upper deck, the true presidential diamond suite glowed in warm, amber light around the wrong guests. Margaret Sterling stood alone on that balcony, looking down at the darkening sea, the gold-embossed welcome card still in her hand. For the first time, she read the name carefully. Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Brooks. A chill moved through her despite the warm evening air. Something was very wrong, and this time she was certain of it. Azure Palm Island Resort rose out of the Atlantic like a dream sculpted for the wealthy. Palm trees bent lazily in the afternoon breeze, white stone pathways curved through tropical gardens, and the Central Park shimmered under the soft Florida sun. At the heart of the resort stood an artificial lagoon ringed with polished marble, its water so clear it reflected the drifting clouds above. A circular fountain sent silver arcs into the air, catching the light like glass. To every arriving guest, the place promised peace. To Elijah and Evelyn Brooks, it would soon become the setting of their deepest humiliation yet. After settling Elijah into the small interior suite the night before, Evelyn had decided the fresh island air might lift his spirits. She dressed him carefully that morning in a clean beige cardigan over a soft blue shirt, smoothing every crease with the same tenderness she had shown for years. Elijah's face still carried the heaviness of yesterday's insults, but when she wheeled him into the gardens and the sunlight touched the water, a faint calm returned to his eyes. Evelyn herself wore a pale lavender dress, simple but neat, with a light shawl over her shoulders. She had slept poorly, haunted by the knowledge that something about this trip was deeply wrong. Yet she refused to let bitterness take this morning, too. Daniel had given them this journey out of love. She owed it to that love to keep trying. The park was alive with quiet elegance. Couples strolled beneath arching bougainvillea. Children of wealthy families tossed crumbs to white ducks near the lagoon's edge. Somewhere in the distance, a violinist played near the breakfast terrace, the notes drifting gently through the humid air. For a moment, Evelyn almost believed the ugliness of the yacht had been left behind at sea. Then she heard heels striking stone. Chloe Whitman approached first, her tall frame moving with predatory confidence along the path. Her blonde hair was now loose over her shoulders, catching the sunlight in pale gold waves, and her resort uniform had been exchanged for a fitted cream daytime blazer that made her look less like staff and more like someone who wished she belonged among the guests. Beside her walked Vanessa Hale, shorter but brisk and sharp-eyed, her auburn hair tucked neatly beneath a silk scarf. Vanessa's expression carried that same cool disdain Evelyn had already come to recognize. The moment Chloe's eyes landed on the Brookses, her mouth curved into a thin smile. "Well," she said, her voice smooth with mock surprise, "I didn't expect to see you two wandering around the private garden area." Evelyn kept her hand steady on Elijah's wheelchair. "We're only enjoying the park." Chloe's smile sharpened. "This section is generally used by premium guests." The implication hung in the air. Elijah's shoulders stiffened. His hands closed around the armrests, and Evelyn felt the tension through the chair itself. "We're guests," Evelyn replied quietly, refusing to give Chloe the satisfaction of visible hurt. Vanessa stepped closer, glancing at the ducks, the lagoon, and then at Elijah as if he were somehow disrupting the aesthetic beauty of the resort. "Some guests know how to act like they belong," she said. Evelyn drew in a slow breath. The cruelty was no longer subtle. It had become deliberate. Before she could decide whether to turn away, Chloe moved behind the wheelchair and laid one manicured hand on the handle. "Let us help," she said. It was not an offer. Evelyn's grip tightened instantly. "No, I've got him." For a brief second, Chloe's polite mask slipped. Her face hardened, and something ugly flashed in her blue eyes, an anger born not of insult, but of being denied control. At the same moment, Vanessa stepped to Evelyn's side and caught her wrist. The move was quick enough to feel instinctive, as if the cruelty had been rehearsed in their minds long before this moment. "Let go of me," Evelyn said sharply. Vanessa's fingers dug deeper. You really should stop making scenes." Behind them, Chloe gave the wheelchair a sharp shove forward. The wheels rolled faster than they should across the smooth marble path, carrying Elijah toward the lagoon's curved edge, where the decorative stone border narrowed dangerously near the water. Elijah's eyes widened. His hands gripped the rails so hard his knuckles blanched beneath dark skin weathered by age and years of labor. "Stop!" Evelyn cried, struggling against Vanessa's hold. A few guests in the distance turned at the sound, but the fountain's rush and the wide spacing of the garden muffled the urgency. Chloe only pushed harder. The front wheels of the chair jolted against the raised stone lip near the lagoon, close enough that one wrong movement could have sent Elijah into the water. Evelyn finally twisted free and reached for her handbag. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my son," she said, breathless but resolute. "Do not touch my husband again." At the mention of her son, Chloe's face changed completely. The mocking calm vanished, replaced by something harsher. Fear sharpened into aggression. In one sudden movement, Chloe snatched the phone from Evelyn's hand. The device spun once in the sunlight before Chloe hurled it downward. It shattered against the marble path with a crack that echoed louder than the fountain. The screen burst into glittering fragments. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared, unable to process the violence of such a small act. That phone was more than a device. It was her lifeline to Daniel, the only direct connection to the one person who would instantly understand what was happening. Elijah made a sound then. Not words, but a guttural burst of rage trapped behind damaged speech. Chloe jerked the wheelchair backward with sudden force. The rear wheels struck uneven stone, the chair tipped. Time seemed to slow. Evelyn lunged forward, but she was too far. Elijah's body slipped sideways, then crashed onto the marble with a sickening thud. His shoulder struck first, then his temple, and the force of the fall sent the chair skidding away across the path. Evelyn screamed his name. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she tried to lift his head. That was when Vanessa grabbed her from behind. The younger woman's grip was merciless, driven by the panic of being exposed. She dragged Evelyn toward the circular fountain basin at the center of the path. Water cascaded in elegant streams above them, beautiful and obscene against the violence unfolding below. "Stop fighting!" Vanessa hissed. Evelyn clawed at the marble rim, but Vanessa was stronger and younger. Then, with shocking force, Vanessa shoved Evelyn's head downward into the shallow decorative basin. Cold water flooded over her face. The world became soundless chaos. Rushing water, marble scraping her palms, lungs burning as she fought to rise. Across the path, Elijah lay helpless on the stone, unable to stand, unable to call for help, forced to watch the woman who had carried his life for decades being brutalized in front of him. Tears spilled from his eyes, mixing with the sweat and pain on his face. It was the most powerless moment of his life. Not the stroke, not the wheelchair, not the loss of speech. This, because now the woman who had become his voice was the one being silenced. Elsewhere in the resort, just beyond the garden wall, Daniel Brooks had finally arrived. Inside a glass-walled administrative corridor overlooking the central plaza, Daniel strode beside Michael Carter, the general manager whose tailored navy suit and silver tie projected flawless authority. Michael's handsome features remained calm, but beneath that composure was calculation. He had already received a discreet text from Chloe minutes earlier. "The old couple is causing trouble in the garden. I'm handling it." Daniel, carrying a leather folio filled with investment proposals, was focused on the future of the resort. His plans included a multi-million-dollar expansion, a world-class accessibility wing, and a charitable foundation supporting mobility care for disabled veterans and stroke survivors. "I want the island to become a model for dignified disability travel," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Not performative accessibility, real respect." Michael nodded smoothly, handing him another folder. "Exactly why your partnership means so much to us." Then Daniel paused. Somewhere beyond the glass, faint and distant, he heard something. A cry. thin beneath the fountain and wind. A woman's voice. For one instant, it sounded like his mother. He turned his head toward the corridor doors leading outside. But Michael moved quickly, sliding a thick stack of architectural plans into Daniel's hands. "There's one more matter," Michael said. "The new therapeutic mobility center. I'd value your approval personally." Daniel hesitated, torn between instinct and obligation. The sound outside faded beneath the corridor's sealed glass and the rustle of papers. He looked down at the plans. And outside, in the paradise he was about to help expand, his parents remained broken on the marble beside the water. The chapter ends with Evelyn still struggling at the fountain's edge, Elijah fallen on the ground, and the terrible distance between truth and rescue still only a few walls away. The fountain water still dripped from Evelyn Brooks's hair in cold, steady lines as she struggled to pull herself upright. Her lavender dress clung heavily to her thin frame, soaked through and darkened by the water Vanessa had forced her into. Her silver-gray curls had come loose from beneath her scarf, hanging wet against her cheeks. Across the marble path, Elijah lay where he had fallen, one shoulder twisted awkwardly against the stone, his breathing shallow and uneven from the shock. The morning beauty of the island park, the palms, the ducks, the shining lagoon, had turned grotesque, every elegant detail now framing cruelty instead of peace. Chloe Whitman stepped back first, her breathing quick but her expression already recovering into calculated control. She was too practiced in manipulation to let panic remain visible for long. Her sharp blue eyes darted from the broken phone pieces on the ground to Elijah sprawled beside the path, and finally to the corridor entrance beyond the garden wall. She understood something dangerous. If Daniel Brooks reached this scene before the narrative was shaped, everything would collapse. Her hand moved instantly to her own phone. A few hundred feet away, in the glass administrative corridor, Daniel had just begun turning toward the garden doors again. The faint cry he thought he had heard still tugging at him. His instincts, honed by years of building companies in rooms full of polished lies, were warning him that something was wrong. That was the exact moment Michael Carter's phone vibrated. Michael glanced at the screen. Chloe. "Two imposters are pretending to be your investors' parents and demanding VIP access. They're causing a disturbance in the Central Park." The message was followed immediately by a call. Michael answered in a low voice, stepping half a pace away from Daniel. On the other end, Chloe's tone was breathless, perfectly pitched between fear and wounded professionalism. "Michael, it's urgent. The older black couple from the yacht, the ones I told you about, they're claiming to be Mr. Daniel Brooks's parents. They attacked staff when confronted. One of them is screaming in the fountain area." Michael's jaw tightened. He was a man who had built his career on reading people quickly, but the flaw in that skill was pride. The moment he believed he understood someone, he stopped questioning the story. And lately, Chloe's influence had made that flaw worse. Her beauty, her calculated vulnerability, and the private relationship that had blurred professional boundaries had quietly rewired his judgment. He no longer evaluated Chloe's claims. He defended them. Daniel looked over. "What is it?" Michael ended the call smoothly, slipping the phone into his jacket. "A minor guest issue in the garden," he said. "I'll resolve it immediately." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Was that the noise I heard?" "Probably just a misunderstanding." Michael gave the practiced smile of a luxury executive trained never to let concern disturb investment conversations. "I'll handle it personally." Daniel's hand had already moved toward his own phone. He dialed Evelyn. No answer. A line formed between his brows. He called again. Still nothing. A sharper unease cut through him now. His mother never ignored his calls, especially not on a trip he had personally arranged. "Michael," Daniel said, his tone harder now, "I'm coming with you." But Michael moved quickly, lifting another set of documents from the side table. Blueprints for the accessibility wing. Daniel had been passionate about. "Before you do, I need your signature on the funding release for the Disability Mobility Initiative. The architects are waiting." The words hit the exact part of Daniel that always chose responsibility first. His dream of building a travel sanctuary for people with disabilities had been shaped by years of watching his father lose independence. The proposal mattered deeply to him. He hesitated, and that hesitation bought Michael exactly what Chloe needed: time. Michael strode through the garden doors alone. By the time he reached the fountain plaza, the scene before him looked nothing like truth. Evelyn, drenched and trembling, was kneeling beside Elijah, her hands shaking as she tried to lift him from the marble. Her hair was disheveled, her face wet, her breathing ragged. Elijah's wheelchair had rolled several feet away, half-turned near the lagoon path. Broken phone glass glittered nearby in the sunlight. Chloe stood a short distance back with Vanessa, both women composed enough to appear shaken rather than guilty. Vanessa's auburn scarf had been deliberately loosened, as if in the aftermath of a struggle. Chloe even had the audacity to hold one hand protectively over her chest. Michael's mind assembled the wrong story before anyone spoke. To him, this looked exactly like what Chloe had described: disruptive outsiders desperate for access, now caught after causing a scene. He turned to Evelyn, and the disgust in his face was immediate. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Evelyn looked up, stunned by the accusation in his voice. "Please. My husband fell. They attacked us." Chloe stepped forward, voice trembling with rehearsed fear. "Michael, I tried to stop them from entering the private guest area. She started yelling that her son owned the resort and demanded special treatment." Vanessa added quietly, "They became violent when we questioned their access." The lie was so cleanly constructed it fit the visible chaos like a tailored suit. Michael looked at Elijah on the ground, then at Evelyn's soaked dress and frantic hands, and instead of seeing victimhood, he saw evidence twisted by Chloe's narrative. "You should be ashamed," he said coldly, "pretending to be the parents of the very man who is about to invest millions into this resort." Evelyn stared at him, disbelief hollowing out her face. "Pretending. He is my son." Michael's voice hardened. "Enough." She reached toward the shattered remains of her phone. "Please, just call Daniel. He'll tell you." The name triggered something uglier in Michael, the instinct to protect Chloe and, by extension, the lie he had already accepted as truth. His hand moved before reason had time to intervene. The slap cracked across the fountain plaza. Evelyn's face snapped sideways with the force of it. For one suspended second, even the water from the fountain seemed too loud. The sting exploded across her cheek, but worse than pain was the shock. In 50 years of hardship, Evelyn Brooks had been insulted, underestimated, and ignored, but never had a stranger struck her for asking to be believed. Elijah let out a guttural cry from the ground, the rawest sound his damaged throat had produced in years. His hand clawed weakly at the marble, trying to drag himself toward her. Michael, breathing harder now, seemed almost startled by his own action, but pride would not let him retreat. "Security will review this," he said sharply. "Until then, stay away from restricted areas." Then he turned, signaling Chloe and Vanessa to follow him. And they left. They left Elijah still on the ground. They left Evelyn kneeling beside him, one cheek burning red, dress soaked, hands trembling. They left the broken wheelchair where it had rolled. They left truth bleeding into marble while lies walked away under polished shoes. Back in the presidential diamond suite above the western deck, Margaret Sterling stood near the balcony doors with the gold-embossed welcome card still in hand. The more she replayed the last 24 hours, the more wrong it all felt. Richard was seated nearby in a leather chair, sipping the final inch of the rare vintage champagne Daniel had intended for Elijah. Margaret turned toward him. "Richard, listen to me. The card says Elijah Brooks. The woman on the yacht said her name was Evelyn Brooks. Don't you see what this means?" Richard, older and usually resistant to discomfort, finally set the glass down. He was a broad-shouldered man whose years in private equity had trained him to trust systems that benefited him. But even he could no longer ignore the mounting inconsistencies. "The service has been excessive," he admitted slowly, "far beyond what our booking should include." Margaret stepped closer, Her normally composed voice edged with concern. "I think we've been receiving someone else's trip." For the first time, Richard's confidence gave way to something more useful: suspicion. Below them, the fountain still sparkled in the sun, hiding the violence that had just unfolded. And in another wing of the resort, Daniel Brooks stared at his phone, calling his mother again and again, hearing only unanswered silence. Night settled over Azure Palm Island Resort like velvet, warm and fragrant with sea air drifting in from the terraces. The grand buffet hall glowed beneath chandeliers shaped like cascading crystal waves, their light scattering across polished marble floors and walls of glass that looked out toward the moonlit ocean. Silver trays steamed beneath golden lamps, the scent of buttered lobster, roasted steak, fresh herbs, and baked bread filling the air. A string quartet played softly from the corner balcony, adding elegance to a room built to make every guest feel important. Yet for Elijah and Evelyn Brooks, this night would strip away the last illusion that dignity could survive silence. Back in their modest cabin, Evelyn had spent nearly an hour helping Elijah recover from the ordeal in the park. She had gently cleaned the scrape near his temple, changed his blue shirt for a fresh charcoal sweater, and carefully adjusted the blanket over his lap once he was settled back into the wheelchair. Her own cheek still carried the faint red imprint of Michael's slap, softened now beneath powder in the dim light of the room. She had changed into a dark navy dress, plain but elegant in its simplicity, the kind of dress she saved for church dinners and anniversaries. Though exhaustion weighed heavily in her shoulders, she refused to let Elijah go to bed carrying only the memory of cruelty. "Let's at least get you something warm to eat," she whispered, smoothing the collar at his neck. Elijah looked up at her, eyes shadowed by pain deeper than the bruise on his shoulder. The day had taken more from him than comfort. It had reopened the old wound of helplessness, the unbearable truth that his wife was still being forced to fight battles he could no longer stand beside her to face. Yet when she rested her hand on his shoulder, the familiar calm of 52 years together steadied him enough to follow her. The buffet hall was crowded when they entered. Guests in resort evening wear moved between carving stations and dessert tables, glasses of wine catching the chandelier light. Men in tailored jackets laughed too loudly near the seafood display. Women in silk dresses compared spa reservations and island excursions. The room smelled of wealth and ease, but as Evelyn guided Elijah through the doorway, the atmosphere around them shifted in subtler ways. Some people glanced first at Elijah's wheelchair. Others noticed Evelyn's modest dress, still too simple among designer fabrics. A few eyes drifted to the fading mark near her cheek. No one asked questions. At the far side of the hall, seated near the panoramic windows, Richard and Margaret Sterling were already dining at the table that should have belonged to the Brooks family. Their candles burned low beside a silver ice bucket holding another bottle of premium champagne. Richard, dressed now in a dark tuxedo jacket, still carried the ease of a man enjoying luxury that had come too easily. But Margaret's posture was different tonight. Her cream silk gown shimmered softly beneath the chandeliers, yet her face held none of its usual poise. Ever since discovering the gold-embossed welcome card, she had been replaying every encounter with the elderly black couple. When Evelyn and Elijah entered, Margaret's breath caught. "That's them," she said quietly. Richard turned and followed her gaze. For the first time, seeing Evelyn's careful tenderness as she guided Elijah through the crowd, the truth became impossible to ignore. The older man's wheelchair accommodations, the couple's quiet dignity, the exact way the staff had dismissed them, all of it aligned too perfectly with the service package they themselves had been receiving. Richard set down his glass, the confidence of entitlement replaced by the dawning discomfort of complicity. Meanwhile, Evelyn guided Elijah to a quieter corner table near a pillar, away from the louder center of the room. She parked the wheelchair carefully, adjusted the brakes, and leaned close. "I'll bring you something soft first," she said gently. "Soup, maybe some fish." Elijah blinked once, grateful even through the weight of humiliation. Evelyn made her way toward the buffet line, moving carefully between clusters of guests. She chose a small plate first. Mashed potatoes, sliced salmon, soft vegetables, and a roll she knew Elijah would still enjoy. Her hands were steady despite the exhaustion running through her body. Then Chloe Whitman appeared. She stepped from behind a column as though she had been waiting for exactly this moment. Tonight, she wore a fitted black evening uniform accented with a silver brooch. Her blonde hair swept elegantly over one shoulder. To the guests around her, she looked every inch the polished hospitality professional. But Evelyn had already seen the cruelty beneath that polished exterior. Chloe's smile was thin and poisonous. Without warning, she pivoted sharply as she passed. Her shoulder slammed into Evelyn's arm. The plate flew from Evelyn's hand. Time fractured into slow motion. The salmon, potatoes, and vegetables splattered across the front of Evelyn's navy dress. The porcelain plate shattered against the marble floor, sending shards skidding in every direction. A smear of sauce streaked across her sleeve and dripped down to the polished stone beneath her shoes. The sound silenced the nearest conversations. Then came the whispers. At first, just a ripple. A couple turning their heads, a laugh muffled behind a wine glass, a woman near the dessert station leaning toward her husband with raised brows. Soon, the murmurs spread wider. She should watch where she's going. Didn't she come in looking soaked earlier? Is she even supposed to be here? Some faces showed pity, others something uglier. Amusement sharpened by class and race, the old instinct to interpret another person's humiliation as entertainment. Evelyn stood frozen, food dripping from her dress, broken porcelain glittering around her feet. For one terrible second, the shame felt heavier than the wet fabric. Across the room, Elijah saw everything. His hands clenched around the wheelchair arm so tightly the tendons in his wrists stood out. His dark eyes, already rimmed with exhaustion, filled with tears that spilled silently down his lined cheeks. He could not stand. He could not shout. He could not even call her name clearly enough for the room to hear. All he could do was watch the woman who had carried him through illness now stand alone in front of strangers who found her suffering amusing. A low, broken sound escaped his throat. Margaret Sterling rose from her chair immediately. Up close, her face, normally so composed, was marked now by genuine remorse. She had spent a lifetime among people who disguised prejudice as etiquette, and she recognized the deliberate cruelty in Chloe's movement for exactly what it was. "That was intentional," she whispered. Richard stood too, slower, but his expression had shifted from uncertainty into something closer to shame. The older financier had built his life around calculated advantage, yet even he could feel the moral rot in remaining silent now. Margaret's voice trembled. "Richard, this entire trip was meant for them." He looked toward the VIP champagne on their table, then toward Elijah weeping silently in his wheelchair. For the first time since boarding the yacht, he truly understood the scale of the theft, not of money, but of dignity. Still, neither moved forward yet, not because they lacked conscience, but because shock often delays courage by a few fatal moments. At the buffet line, Chloe bent slightly as if to help gather the broken pieces, though the smirk at the corner of her mouth betrayed satisfaction. "I'm so sorry," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, the false sweetness in her voice turning the cruelty into performance. "These floors can be slippery." Evelyn looked at her, and for the first time the hurt in her eyes gave way to something stronger. Not anger. Resolve. She said nothing, because words would only feed the spectacle Chloe wanted. Instead, she bent slowly, despite the ache in her back and the sting still lingering in her cheek, and began picking up the larger shards herself. The room watched. Some with pity, some with disdain. Some, with the detached fascination people reserve for disasters they are relieved are happening to someone else. And at the center of it all sat Elijah Brooks, tears falling freely now, his chest trembling with silent sobs, every instinct in him screaming to protect the woman kneeling in humiliation before him. But his body remained still. The chapter closes on that unbearable image. Evelyn kneeling on the marble floor, gathering shattered porcelain from her own dress. Chloe standing over her in false concern, the Sterling couple frozen in dawning guilt, and Elijah in his wheelchair weeping under the chandelier light, powerless as the cruelty reaches its cruelest point yet. The shattered porcelain still glittered beneath the chandelier light when the doors of the grand buffet hall opened. At first, it was only the shift in atmosphere that gave it away. The sudden hush of nearby conversations, the instinctive turning of heads, the way even the quartet near the balcony seemed to lose its rhythm for a beat. Then Daniel Brooks stepped inside. Tall, composed, and unmistakably commanding, Daniel carried the kind of presence that made a room reorganize itself around him. At 46, he was every inch the architect of empires, broad-shouldered in a tailored midnight suit, warm brown skin set against the crisp white of his shirt, dark eyes sharpened by intelligence and the discipline of a man who had learned to survive rooms full of masks. Yet tonight, the polished control that usually defined him cracked the instant he saw the woman kneeling on the marble floor. His mother, Evelyn Brooks, was bent over the broken plate, food staining the front of her navy dress, one hand braced against the polished floor to steady herself. The faint bruise on her cheek had darkened beneath the warm light, and the exhaustion in her shoulders seemed suddenly unbearable when seen through her son's eyes. For one terrible heartbeat, Daniel simply stared. Then he moved. He crossed the marble floor in long, urgent strides, ignoring the startled guests who instinctively stepped aside. By the time Evelyn's balance gave way and she began to sway from the strain of kneeling too long, Daniel was already there. He dropped to one knee and caught her before she could fall. "Mom." The word came out rougher than anyone in the room had ever heard from him. Evelyn looked up, stunned, and the moment her eyes met his, every wall she had been holding up all day nearly collapsed. The strength she had borrowed from habit, dignity, and endurance finally had somewhere safe to rest. "Daniel," she whispered. The room froze. The quartet stopped completely. The low laughter vanished. Even the waitstaff nearest the carving station stood motionless. At the far side of the buffet line, Chloe Whitman's face drained of all color. The blonde hospitality supervisor, so polished only moments earlier, now looked like a woman watching the ground vanish beneath her. Her blue eyes widened, lips parting soundlessly as the truth she had spent 2 days bearing arrived in the flesh, holding the very woman she had humiliated. Beside her, Vanessa Hale visibly trembled. The auburn-haired staff member clutched the edge of a serving station, her carefully composed posture unraveling into fear. She had followed Chloe's cruelty with the cowardice of someone who mistakes obedience for safety, and now the illusion of protection was collapsing. Near the rear entrance, Michael Carter had just stepped into the hall after finishing a meeting with Daniel's legal liaison. He stopped dead. The general manager's tailored navy suit, once a symbol of control, now seemed to constrict around him. His usually measured face went rigid as memory collided with reality. The slap in the garden, Chloe's lies, Daniel's unanswered concern, the investor whose trust he had just betrayed at the deepest possible level. Daniel slowly rose, keeping one hand steady on Evelyn's shoulder as he helped her stand. Then he turned. His gaze moved across the room, taking in every face, every silent witness, every staff member pretending not to know what had happened. Finally, his eyes landed on Chloe. When he spoke, the temperature of the room seemed to drop. "Who did this to my mother?" No one answered, not because the question was unclear, but because truth had become too dangerous to touch. Evelyn, still leaning lightly against Daniel's arm, looked at Chloe's pale face and Vanessa's shaking hands. Years of hardship had taught her that cruelty often grew from weakness, fear, and the false hierarchies people inherited before they ever learned compassion. And despite everything, the fountain, the broken phone, the buffet humiliation, mercy still rose instinctively in her. "It was an accident," she said softly. Daniel turned to her, disbelief flickering through his expression. Evelyn forced a faint, tired smile. "Please, baby, don't make this bigger than it needs to be." Her instinct was not denial, it was mercy. She had spent her life believing that punishment alone never changed a heart. Sometimes the greater lesson came from grace. Across the room, Chloe's knees nearly buckled with relief. For one fleeting second, she thought Evelyn's kindness might save her. But kindness can only protect lies until truth can no longer bear its own silence. At the corner table near the pillar, Elijah Brooks had been watching everything through a veil of tears. The sight of Daniel holding Evelyn should have brought comfort. Instead, it shattered the final restraint inside him. For years after the stroke, words had existed in Elijah like trapped thunder. Doctors had called the damage permanent. Therapists had taught him patience, gestures, breathing exercises, hope measured in millimeters. But the mind of the old mechanic had never truly accepted silence. The words had remained, buried beneath broken pathways, waiting for some force strong enough to break through. Now that force was pain. Not his own. Hers. His chest heaved. His shoulders trembled. The tears came harder, carving bright paths through the deep lines of his weathered face. Then, from somewhere deeper than speech therapy, deeper than medicine, deeper than the years of helplessness, a sound tore free. The single word hit the room like a crack of thunder. Every head turned. Evelyn's breath caught. Daniel spun toward his father, disbelief flooding his face. Elijah gripped the wheelchair arms, every muscle in his neck straining as if each syllable had to fight its way through stone. Humiliated. The word came broken, uneven, but unmistakably real. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, tears rising instantly. Daniel took one step toward him, eyes wide. Elijah's gaze locked onto his son with the desperate urgency of a man who had been forced to watch the woman he loved endure everything in his place. Your mother. Silence crashed over the buffet hall. Not the silence of discomfort, the silence of revelation. For Daniel, the moment was bigger than outrage. His father had spoken. After years of damaged nerves, failed therapies, and the quiet grief of believing some losses never returned, Elijah had found his voice through the unbearable need to defend Evelyn. Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of the wheelchair, one hand gripping his father's shoulder. "Dad!" His voice broke. "You're speaking!" Elijah's tears kept falling, but this time there was something else in his face. Release, not full recovery, not a miracle, but proof that love had found a path where medicine had failed. The emotional shock of the moment cracked the paralysis holding the room. Margaret Sterling stepped forward first. Elegant even in distress, her cream silk gown now seemed less like luxury and more like the costume of someone ashamed to have worn another family's honor. Her blue-gray eyes were wet, not with self-pity, but with remorse sharpened into responsibility. "Mr. Brooks," she said, addressing Daniel directly, "your parents are telling the truth." Every eye in the hall shifted toward her. Margaret drew in a breath. "From the moment we boarded the yacht in Miami, Chloe greeted my husband and me as your parents. We tried to question the level of service, but she insisted it was correct. The suite, the champagne, the private dining, the premium deck seating, all of it was given to us under the Brooks reservation." Richard Sterling rose beside her. The older financier, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, no longer wore the easy entitlement that had marked him before. Shame had made him smaller, but perhaps more honest. "She's right," he said. "Every luxury we received was clearly intended for this family. We should have spoken sooner." Margaret's voice trembled. "And tonight, what happened to Mrs. Brooks was no accident." At those words, Chloe's composure finally shattered. Her lips parted, her hands shook visibly. The carefully polished image she had built over years of manipulation crumbled under the weight of multiple witnesses. Michael Carter, still frozen near the entrance, looked as though someone had drained the life from him. The truth had now become undeniable, and worse, it had been spoken by the very father whose dignity he had already betrayed. Daniel slowly stood, turning from his father to the room of witnesses, liars, and bystanders. The truth was finally alive. and it had entered the room in his father's voice. For several long seconds after Elijah's broken words filled the buffet hall, no one moved. The chandeliers still shimmered overhead. The ocean beyond the glass walls still rolled beneath moonlight. The string quartet remained frozen in silence. But the room was no longer the same. Truth had finally taken shape in voices that could no longer be ignored. First in Margaret Sterling's testimony, then in Richard's confirmation, and finally in the trembling, hard-won words of Elijah Brooks himself. Every lie Chloe Whitman had built over the course of the trip now stood exposed beneath the brightest lights in the resort. Daniel Brooks turned slowly toward Michael Carter. The general manager, once the embodiment of polished authority, now looked like a man stripped of every shield he had ever trusted. His face had gone pale, his silver tie hanging slightly crooked, his hands trembling faintly at his sides. The confident executive who had believed he could control the story now stood before the one man whose trust mattered most, and he knew exactly what he had done. Without another word, Michael stepped forward. Then, in front of the entire buffet hall, he dropped to his knees. The sound of his polished shoes striking marble echoed through the silence. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his usually measured voice now raw with shame. "I was wrong." His eyes lifted to Evelyn, and for the first time since she had met him there was no arrogance left in them, only horror at his own reflection. "I trusted the wrong person. I raised my hand against a woman who was only trying to protect her husband. There is no excuse for what I did in that garden." His voice shook. "I am deeply sorry for the slap, and for every moment after it." The image was almost surreal. The powerful resort manager kneeling before the elderly woman he had struck, in a room full of guests who had only hours earlier whispered over her humiliation. Evelyn looked down at him, her face calm despite the fading bruise still visible on her cheek. Before she could answer, Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "Chloe Whitman." The name landed like judgment. At the far side of the room, Chloe's body visibly stiffened. Her carefully styled blonde hair, immaculate uniform, and polished posture had once helped her project control. Now, they only made the fear in her face more obvious. She stepped forward slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Vanessa Hale followed a pace behind, her shoulders hunched inward, the earlier cruelty drained out of her and replaced by panic. Daniel's expression was unreadable. "Come here." The guests parted as Chloe approached the center of the hall, every eye following her. By now, the reality of what she had done had finally broken through her arrogance. She had spent years mistaking presentation for power, believing that class, appearance, and race gave her the authority to decide who deserved respect. Tonight, that worldview had collapsed in the most public way possible. When she reached Evelyn, Chloe's lower lip trembled. I'm sorry," she stammered, but the apology sounded thin, more frightened than sincere. Then, driven by desperation, she lifted her own hand and slapped herself sharply across the face. The sound cracked through the hall. Again. A second slap, harder. Tears spilled down her cheeks as panic replaced pride. "Please forgive me," she said, voice breaking. "Please don't let me lose everything." Vanessa gasped softly behind her, horrified. Even Michael, still kneeling, looked stunned, but before Chloe could strike herself again, Evelyn stepped forward and gently caught her wrist. Enough. The word was soft, yet it carried more authority than any title in the building. Chloe froze, tears clinging to her lashes. Evelyn looked not only at Chloe but at the guests, the staff, Michael, Vanessa, and even Daniel. Her voice, though gentle, carried clearly through the silent hall. "Do not ever measure a person's worth by the color of their skin," she said, "and do not ever judge dignity by the clothes someone wears." The words settled over the room with the force of truth earned through suffering. "In service," she continued, "every guest deserves the same respect. People pay not only for rooms, food, and luxury. They pay to feel safe, welcomed, and valued. If you work in this industry, then fairness is not optional. It is the first duty. No one spoke. Some guests lowered their eyes in shame. Some staff members stood straighter, as if realizing they were hearing something larger than a reprimand. Even Margaret Sterling wiped quietly at the corner of one eye. Daniel looked at his mother with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with the moral strength that had carried their family through decades of hardship. Then the businessman in him returned. Not cold, but decisive. His gaze moved first to Chloe. "You are terminated, effective immediately." Chloe's face crumpled, then to Vanessa. "You too." Vanessa lowered her head, tears of fear replacing the easy cruelty she had borrowed from Chloe. Finally, Daniel looked at Michael, still kneeling. "And you, Michael Carter, are removed from your position as general manager as of tonight." Michael closed his eyes briefly, accepting the judgment with the hollow stillness of a man who knew it was deserved. But Daniel was not finished. He turned to the assembled staff and guests. "As of this week, every property in the Brooks Hospitality Group will begin mandatory anti-discrimination and dignity in service training. This includes race bias, class prejudice, disability respect, and guest equity standards." Murmurs moved through the room. The announcement was larger than punishment. It was structural change, the kind that outlasted scandal. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "And the resort's charitable accessibility initiative will now be renamed the Elijah and Evelyn Brooks Foundation for Dignified Travel." This time, the silence broke into soft applause, not celebration. Recognition. Recognition that something broken had been forced into honesty. The following morning, the atmosphere of Azure Palm Island Resort felt transformed. A handwritten apology from the executive board waited in the presidential diamond oceanfront villa, now properly reassigned to the Brooks family. Fresh flowers lined the terrace. A private chef prepared Elijah's favorite breakfast: soft eggs, warm biscuits, and perfectly seasoned steak strips cut into manageable pieces. Most importantly, there was peace. Daniel extended the trip by another week. "This island is going to give you the vacation it should have given you from the beginning," he told them. And for the first time since arriving, it finally did. Days later, as the sun dipped low over the western shoreline, the three of them walked, or in Elijah's case rolled, along the private beach. The sky burned in shades of amber, rose, and violet. The tide whispered over the sand. Palm shadows stretched long behind them. Daniel, jacket removed and sleeves rolled, pushed Elijah's wheelchair himself, one hand steady on the handle, the other occasionally adjusting the blanket over his father's lap whenever the breeze grew cooler. Evelyn walked beside them, one hand resting lightly over Elijah's. The years of struggle, humiliation, and pain had not disappeared. But in this moment, they no longer defined the journey. They had arrived at something deeper than luxury: justice, healing, family. Elijah lifted his eyes toward the horizon, where the sun melted into the sea. The golden light reflected in his tears, but now those tears held peace rather than helplessness. His lips parted slowly. The word came fragile, barely above the sound of the waves. "Beautiful." Daniel stopped walking. Evelyn covered Elijah's hand with both of hers, tears shining in her own eyes now. The sunset stretched endlessly before them, warm and forgiving. And there, on the island where they had once been humiliated, the Brooks family finally received what Daniel had wanted for them from the beginning. Not wealth, not status, but a memory touched by love, dignity, and peace. Under the last light of evening, husband and wife held hands, their son beside them, and the ocean carried the day gently into night. A family reunited, a wound answered, a lesson that would outlive the island itself. The lesson of this story is simple but deeply important for everyday life. We never truly know the battles another person is carrying. The clothes someone wears, the color of their skin, their age, or even their silence can never tell us their worth. In daily life, whether we meet someone in a restaurant, a hospital, a workplace, or simply on the street, The way we choose to treat them says far more about our own character than it does about theirs. This story gently reminds us that dignity, kindness, and fairness should never depend on status or appearance. Prejudice often begins in small moments: a look of disrespect, a careless word, a decision made too quickly. But those small moments can wound people deeply. On the other hand, a small act of kindness, patience, or respect can heal more than we realize. That is the educational heart of this story. Every human being deserves equal respect, and true strength is shown through compassion. We should also reflect on the people who stayed silent. In real life, injustice often grows because good people watch and say nothing. Let this story encourage us to speak up when we see someone being treated unfairly, whether because of race, disability, poverty, or appearance. Change begins with ordinary people making better choices in ordinary moments. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs this reminder today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. If you believe the world needs more stories about dignity, justice, and kindness, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that change lives. May God bless every person watching this video, protect your family, fill your home with peace, and give you the wisdom to always choose kindness over judgment. If this message speaks to your heart, comment Amen below and let us know you stand for respect, fairness, and love in everyday life.